I'm Emily, 29, the youngest in my family. I thought my sister's wedding might finally be the moment they'd see me, but nothing had changed. They told me not to sit with the family, just find a spot in the back. I didn't argue, but the day didn't end the way they expected. The scent of fresh roses hit me as soon as I stepped into the reception hall. White satin draped over every table, crystal glasses catching the soft glow from chandeliers above. It was my sister Sarah's wedding day, a day my parents had been planning for months, maybe years. And yet I wasn't supposed to be in any of the photos. Mom's words from last week still clung to me. "It's better if you just stay in the background, Emily. We don't want to upset the flow." She'd said it casually while flipping through a binder of floral arrangements, as if I were just another logistical inconvenience. I stood just inside the door, holding onto the strap of my small clutch bag, trying to blend into the crowd. Guests laughed and hugged in warm bursts around me, the kind of easy affection that seems rehearsed over decades. A photographer zigzagged between tables, capturing moments none of which would include me. By the coat rack near the entrance, an older man in a dark suit handed his jacket to the attendant. The spot seemed quiet, out of the way, and perfect for what my parents had in mind, me being invisible. I stationed myself there, nodding politely to people I barely recognized, watching the swirl of silk gowns and navy suits. From across the room, Mom glanced over, then quickly looked away. She was radiant in a silver dress, her hand resting lightly on Dad's arm. They moved through the crowd like hosts in a perfectly staged play. Sarah, in her lace gown, was surrounded by a circle of friends and bridesmaids laughing, leaning in close for group shots. The photographer's camera clicked in rapid bursts. Each flash felt like a reminder of my absence. A woman in emerald green leaned in towards Sarah, adjusting the train of her gown just so. Mom joined in the shot, beaming. Dad stood tall, one arm around Sarah's shoulders. I tried not to fidget. My heels pressed into the plush carpet, my fingers smoothing over the edge of my clutch. From where I stood, I could see the buffet being set up, the champagne glasses lined in perfect rows. The low hum of conversation was punctuated by bursts of laughter from the main table. Aunt Margaret appeared from nowhere, her deep red dress a contrast against the ivory decor. She walked past me, but gave a small nod, one that said she saw me, even if no one else did. She didn't stop, just moved toward the main table, with the grace of someone who knew exactly when to speak and when to remain silent. I stayed by the coat rack, watching the photographer gesture for a bigger smile, a tighter grouping. My name was never called. No one waved me over. Somewhere in the background, a violinist started playing softly. The melody floated through the air like it was meant to make everything feel whole, but for me it only sharpened the outline of the distance between us. I shifted my weight, letting my eyes drift to the doorway where more guests trickled in, brushing snowflakes from their coats. The laughter swelled again near the head table. Someone raised a glass, and all heads turned toward Sarah. I stayed in my corner, my lips pressing into the faintest smile. No one noticed, and that was exactly how they wanted it. But as the evening light caught the edge of the photographer's lens, I caught something too, a glint in Aunt Margaret's eyes, as she glanced back at me before turning away. It was fleeting, but it felt like a bookmark in a story that wasn't finished yet. I straightened my posture, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the coat rack as if anchoring myself. This was their stage. But stages have curtains, and curtains can close. Somewhere in the pit of my stomach, a quiet certainty began to settle, not the kind that makes you act right away, but the kind that waits patient and deliberate until the timing is perfect. For now, I stayed still. Let them play their roles. I knew my cue would come, and when it did, they wouldn't be ready. The reception hall buzzed with an energy I could almost feel vibrating through the carpet beneath my shoes. It wasn't the kind of energy you could share from the edges. It was a circle, tight and exclusive, with no room for an extra chair. From my post by the coat rack, I could see everything without being in it, as though I were watching a play through a glass wall. A waiter passed me with a tray of champagne flutes. I stepped slightly aside so he could pass the scent of citrus and yeast from the drinks lingering in the air. He didn't offer me one, assuming rightly that I wasn't part of the scene being served just yet. My fingers brushed over the edge of my clutch again, the leather warm from my hand. Across the room, Dad leaned over to speak to a couple I didn't recognize, his posture easy, his smile perfectly rehearsed. He was a master at public charm, knowing exactly when to lower his voice for effect, when to glance towards Sarah to draw attention to her. Every gesture was a performance. Sarah, glowing in her lace gown, turned toward the photographer again. She had that practiced tilt to her head that made her look delicate and approachable in photos, even though her eyes darted quickly to make sure every shot flattered her. A bridesmaid adjusted her veil, tucking a loose strand behind her ear. Another guest joked about the snow outside, and the group laughed like old friends. I kept my smile in place even when no one looked at me. That was the trick. If you stop smiling, you become visible in the wrong way. It's easier to fade when you appear content. At one point, a young cousin ran past me chasing a balloon, nearly knocking into my leg. He mumbled a quick sorry before dashing back toward the main table. His mother glanced at me briefly, then redirected her gaze to Sarah without missing a beat. From where I stood, the moments blurred together, the sound of cutlery being arranged, the clinking of glasses, the soft shuffle of the photographer's shoes as he positioned himself for yet another shot. Then a familiar voice broke through the hum, Aunt Margaret again this time, speaking to a man in a tailored navy suit. Her tone was warm, but there was a weight in her pauses, as though she was measuring each word. The man chuckled at something she said, then followed her gaze across the room. Straight to me. It wasn't long, a few seconds at most, but I saw his expression shift from casual to curious, like he'd just noticed something he wasn't supposed to. He said something quietly to Aunt Margaret before they both turned back toward the head table. A server began lighting the candles along each table, their flames trembling slightly with each pass. The air felt warmer now, heavier. Somewhere near the bar, a laugh rang out a little too loud, and people turned to look, then quickly went back to their conversations. I stayed by the coat rack, my small island in the middle of a sea I had no permission to swim in. The coat attendant glanced at me once as if to check whether I was waiting for someone. I offered a polite shake of the head, and then without warning, the photographer's voice carried across the room. "Let's get the whole family in this one." I felt the weight of the words even before I saw the movement. People began shifting chairs, scraping lightly against the floor. Mom's gaze swept the crowd like a searchlight, and then stopped before it reached me. She turned back toward the cluster forming around Sarah. No one called my name. The camera clicked its flash, momentarily brightening the room. From my distance, I could see the perfect symmetry of their arrangement, the way Sarah stood dead center, flanked by Mom and Dad, with extended family filling the edges. I stayed rooted in place, hands clasped loosely in front of me as though I were exactly where I was meant to be. In the reflection of the glass door beside the coat rack, I caught my own expression, calm, steady, and entirely in control of what they thought they were controlling. The first photo finished, and the photographer called for one more for safety. I almost smiled, not because I was in it, but because I wasn't, and that in ways they didn't yet understand was the safest thing for me. The room's noise began to settle as the DJ announced that dinner would be served soon. The clinking of glasses and low chatter shifted into the soft rustle of people taking their seats. I could see the servers moving in coordinated lines, setting plates and refilling water glasses. I stayed put, my back lightly against the wall beside the coat rack. The light here was dimmer, the air cooler from the draft of the entryway. It felt separate, safe in a way, but also sharpened the edges of the scene in front of me. From this distance, I could pick up moments others would miss. A bridesmaid discreetly checking her phone under the tablecloth. Dad leaning in to whisper something to Mom that made her lips curl into a restrained smile. Sarah smoothing the front of her dress and scanning the room like she was cataloging every pair of eyes on her. At one point, a server carrying a tray of appetizers caught my gaze and hesitated for a fraction of a second before moving on. He didn't offer me one. Not out of rudeness, it was just the invisible line, the quiet separation that had been in place long before tonight. I could feel the familiar weight of it, the way it pressed just enough to remind me of my place without making a scene. And yet under that weight, there was also a strange calm. From the main table, someone laughed, a sharp ringing sound that cut through the music. Several heads turned toward the source. Sarah was leaning toward one of her friends, her expression animated. I couldn't hear the words, but I could tell it was a story meant to entertain at someone's expense. The photographer moved past me to adjust his lens, his shoulder brushing mine lightly. He gave a polite nod but didn't stop. Moments later, his voice rose again. "Let's get just the siblings in this one." I watched the shuffle happen. Chairs, moving hands, adjusting jackets, smiles resetting. My name wasn't called. The click of the camera was crisp, deliberate. I caught a glimpse of their image in the preview screen, perfectly framed, every smile aligned. The coat rack beside me swayed slightly as a guest retrieved a jacket to drape over their chair. The scent of cold air clung to the fabric. I inhaled quietly, letting the moment pass through me without leaving a mark. The truth was, they thought this was the story, me standing aside, excluded watching. But they didn't know I had already decided where my place in this day would be. It wasn't here, not yet. And as I glanced toward the far corner where Aunt Margaret now spoke in low tones to someone I hadn't seen before, I felt the first quiet spark of the part they wouldn't see coming. Dinner service began, and with it the hum of conversation swelled again. From my post near the coat rack, I could see every table slowly filling with plated salads, greens tossed neatly, vinaigrette catching the light. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the air, making my stomach ache in a way that wasn't about hunger. I stayed where I was, sipping water from a small bottle I'd tucked into my clutch earlier. It was easier this way, less chance of being the one standing awkwardly at a table while someone forgot to pull out a chair for me. The photographer's voice rang out again. "Let's do parents with the bride." Chairs scraped as Sarah and my parents stood, their bodies angling toward the camera like they'd practiced. Mom's hand smoothed Sarah's veil. Dad's arm rested proudly around her waist. Their smiles looked effortless. The flash popped, freezing the image. And then, as if on cue, Sarah glanced toward the coat rack toward me. The smile stayed, but there was something in her eyes, a glint that said she knew exactly what she was doing. Aunt Margaret appeared at my side, moving quietly, as if she'd been there the whole time. "They didn't save you a seat, did they?" she murmured. I shook my head, keeping my gaze forward. "No, it's fine." She studied me for a beat, then nodded toward the far side of the room. "Come with me. There's someone I'd like you to meet." We wove between tables, past clinking glasses and polite laughter. I caught fragments of conversation, honeymoon destinations, the quality of the fish, how beautiful Sarah looked tonight. It was all surface level, smooth as polished stone. In the far corner, a man stood near a small table by himself. He was older, with silver hair and a tailored suit that didn't try too hard. When Aunt Margaret introduced us, his handshake was warm but measured. "This is Richard," she said simply. "He's known your family for a long time." Richard's gaze was steady, almost assessing. "I've heard a lot about you, Emily," he said. I smiled faintly. I'm sure not all of it was good. He chuckled, a sound without malice. "Maybe not. But that's why I prefer to see for myself." We spoke quietly for a few minutes about my work, about how long it had been since I'd seen Aunt Margaret. There was no rush, no probing questions, just a sense that he was taking stock. From across the room, I caught Dad glancing in our direction. His brow furrowed for a moment before he looked away. When Aunt Margaret excused herself to greet another guest, Richard leaned slightly closer. "You don't have to stand by that coat rack all night," he said. "Sometimes the best vantage point is right in the middle." I didn't answer, but the words lingered. They weren't pushy, but they carried weight. Back at the main table, the speeches had begun. Sarah's maid of honor was speaking, her voice bright and practiced. Laughter followed each joke. My parents sat front and center, nodding approvingly. I lingered in the shadows, catching every beat. I knew this rhythm. It was the build-up before the part where someone would decide to remind me in their own subtle way exactly where I stood. And right on cue, it came. Sarah's voice broke in after the applause. "Before we wrap up, I just want to thank everyone who's been there for me, who stood by my side through everything." She scanned the room, her gaze slipping right past me as if I were air. "I couldn't have done this without my family, every single one of them." The applause swelled again, warm and whole, and I stood there, invisible, letting it wash over me like cold rain. But in that moment, something shifted, not in them, but in me. Richard's words came back, threading through the noise. "Sometimes the best vantage point is right in the middle." Dinner moved into the main course, and the waitstaff carried trays of roasted chicken, vegetables glistening under warm lights. I watched them weave between tables, the smell of rosemary filling the air. At my post along the side wall, now closer than the coat rack but still out of the spotlight, I noticed how each table seemed to lean inward toward Sarah, their focus magnetized to her like moths to a flame. She thrived on it, tossing her hair lightly, laughing in a way that felt choreographed. Mom passed her a bread roll and whispered something in her ear. Sarah laughed, but it was a sharper sound, one I'd heard before, just loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. Her eyes flicked toward me, then back to her plate. I shifted my weight, careful not to fidget. The temptation to walk out was strong, but so was the quiet satisfaction of staying. Sometimes being present, not retreating, was the only act of defiance you needed. Richard reappeared this time, with 2 glasses of sparkling water. For the wallflower, he said, setting one down on a side table beside me. I don't mind the view, I replied, keeping my tone light. You shouldn't, he said, glancing toward the head table. People reveal a lot when they think you're not watching. His words hung between us as the father of the groom took the microphone. He thanked everyone for coming, told a brief story about meeting Sarah, then turned to the groom with a grin. The room was warm with approval until his next words. And of course, he said, a wedding is a chance to see family come together, even if sometimes not everyone fits the picture. It wasn't a joke, but a ripple of polite chuckles passed through the crowd. My parents didn't laugh, but neither did they object. I felt the weight of a few curious glances from guests who didn't know me well enough to connect the dots, but the remark landed exactly where it was aimed. I took a sip of water, letting the bubbles sting my throat, and kept my face neutral. Richard's gaze sharpened. That was uncalled for, he muttered almost to himself. Maybe I said, but it's not the first time. The room's energy shifted again when Sarah stood microphone in hand. Let's take a moment for table photos, she called. We want to remember every face here tonight. The photographer began making rounds. He paused near me, camera lowering slightly as if unsure. Sarah's voice carried over. Oh, no need for that one. We'll get family shots later. It was smooth, almost kind on the surface, but I caught the brief flash of triumph in her smile. I nodded, stepping back so he could move on. The act of removing myself before anyone could push me further felt like reclaiming a tiny sliver of control. From across the room, Aunt Margaret's expression tightened. She was watching me closely now, her lips pressed into a thin line. Dinner plates were cleared and the first notes of music began. Couples drifted toward the dance floor, dresses swaying, shoes tapping lightly. I stayed where I was, the rhythm of the music a background pulse to the slow, deliberate pace of my own breathing. There was no rush. I could wait as long as it took. As the evening edged toward speeches, the groom's best man took the stage. His voice was warm, his anecdotes dotted with gentle humor. The crowd was in high spirits again until he mentioned a story about how tight-knit this family is. My eyes flicked toward my parents. Mom's smile widened as if to confirm the claim. Dad clapped loudly, almost performative. No one at their table looked my way. It wasn't anger I felt, but an odd, hollow space where connection should have been. That absence had a familiar shape by now. Between speeches, I stepped toward the refreshment table. The light from the chandelier above caught on the silver coffee urn, and for a moment my reflection stared back at me, small, peripheral, framed by the bustle behind. A gentle voice broke the moment. Emily, isn't it? I turned to see the groom's aunt, an elegant woman in her 60s, her eyes sharp but kind. Yes, I replied. She leaned in slightly. I noticed how you've been treated tonight. Her words were deliberate without pity. That alone made me stand a little straighter. It's fine, I said. She tilted her head, studying me for a beat. It's noted, she murmured before moving away to greet another guest. The band struck up a slower tune. Chairs scraped back as more guests joined the dance floor. My parents danced once with Sarah and her new husband, the photographer, clicking dutifully. When the bouquet toss was announced, I stayed rooted to my spot. The group of single women gathered, laughter bouncing off the walls. Sarah glanced toward me just once before turning her back and letting the bouquet fly. I didn't watch where it landed. Instead, I noticed Aunt Margaret again, now seated beside Richard near the edge of the dance floor. Their conversation was quiet, but intense eyes occasionally darting toward me. The final blow of the night came when the MC announced the official family portraits. "Parents of the bride siblings, please join us," he called. I knew better than to move. The photographer didn't even look in my direction this time. Sarah's voice was bright. "Just immediate family for this one." It should have stung, but instead I felt a calm settle over me. This predictable exclusion was almost a script we'd rehearsed for years. The difference now was that I'd stopped trying to rewrite their lines. From my vantage point, I saw the cluster of them pose smiles sharp as glass. The flash went off. Richard caught my eye across the room, then subtly gestured toward the back entrance. I didn't move yet, but the seed was planted. Whatever came next, I'd decide when the time was right. The night wasn't over, and neither was I. The next morning, the air outside was sharp with early spring chill. I walked the short distance from my apartment to the cafe Richard had suggested. It was one of those quiet spots tucked into the corner of an older street, the kind of place that smelled of fresh bread and espresso the moment you stepped inside. Richard was already there, seated near the back, his posture casual, but his eyes alert. Aunt Margaret sat beside him, hands folded neatly on the table. She was the one who gestured for me to join them. Emily, Richard began once I sat down. "I wanted to apologize for what I saw last night." I shook my head. "It's not the first time." Aunt Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "That's the problem. It shouldn't be normal." The conversation shifted quickly, bypassing small talk. Margaret leaned in. "You know the fundraiser the family's hosting next month?" I nodded faintly. I'd heard Sarah brag about it weeks ago. "Well, your parents have positioned it as an exclusive event, but Richard and we have other plans." She slid a cream-colored envelope toward me. Inside was an official invitation, my name printed cleanly in gold script. I looked up puzzled. "You'll be introduced as our guest of honor," Margaret said evenly. "Not theirs. Ours." The words landed like a pebble in still water ripples spreading through me. Why, I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. Richard's tone was matter-of-fact, "Because people should see the truth, and because your parents have been trading on a false image for too long. It's time for them to realize they don't control every room." I didn't answer immediately. My instinct wasn't to fight, but to consider the implications. It wasn't revenge I wanted, it was space, legitimacy, and maybe finally an acknowledgement that I existed outside their narrative. Over the next few weeks, I prepared in silence. I didn't tell friends, and I certainly didn't tell family. The day of the fundraiser, the Grand Hotel ballroom was draped in white and gold chandeliers, scattering warm light over the crowd. My parents were already circulating near the center, their laughter carrying easily over the hum of conversation. Sarah was beside them, glowing in a fitted dress, her hand looped through her husband's arm. I waited near the entrance until the MC began introductions, and now his voice boomed, "Please welcome our guest of honor, Emily Carter." The room turned. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Then a low wave of murmurs began to spread. I walked forward steadily, the click of my heels threading through the silence. Margaret and Richard were waiting at the stage steps, greeting me with warm, unhurried smiles. My parents' faces had shifted moments earlier, all brightness now caught between confusion and something sharper. I didn't glance their way. Instead, I turned toward the crowd, feeling the weight of every gaze settle on me. Whatever they'd expected from me, distance, absence, compliance, was no longer the script I was following. This time I was standing in the center, and there was no one directing me off stage. Applause broke out, polite, a little tentative, but enough to fill the room. I smiled lightly, just enough to be courteous, then stepped onto the stage beside Margaret and Richard. The MC handed me the microphone, but I didn't launch into a speech. Instead, I let the quiet stretch a few seconds longer than expected. "I'm honored to be here tonight," I began, my voice even. "It means a great deal to be welcomed into a space that celebrates integrity and shared effort." My words were simple, but I knew how they landed. Anyone paying attention would hear what I didn't say, what had been absent in other rooms I'd entered before. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother shift her weight, her smile fixed, but thinner. My father's jaw tightened. Sarah, for once, wasn't talking. Her eyes moved between me and the stage steps, as though calculating whether she should approach later. Margaret stepped in then, taking the mic and speaking warmly about my work with a local community program. It wasn't glamorous, but it was genuine, and hearing it acknowledged in front of so many people felt strange, unfamiliar, yet grounding. When she handed the microphone back, I closed with just a few words. "Thank you for seeing me." No flourish, no long explanation, just that. The rest of the evening passed in a steady hum. People I barely knew came over to shake my hand, to ask about my work, to say they'd like to meet again. Margaret and Richard never left my side for long, making introductions smooth, deliberate. At one point, my parents approached. My mother's voice was tight but measured. "We didn't know you'd be here." "I was invited," I said, still smiling. Sarah tried to laugh it off as though the whole thing was a misunderstanding, but Richard stepped forward before she could smooth over the edges. Some invitations aren't theirs to give or withhold. His tone was calm, but it cut through the air. They didn't linger long after that. I watched them drift toward the exit before the night was over, their usual orbit broken. Later, as I left the ballroom, the cool night air felt sharper, clearer. I wasn't walking away with a grand victory to flaunt, but something quieter control over my own presence. They could choose to ignore me again tomorrow, but after tonight, they couldn't pretend they hadn't seen me. For the first time in years, that was enough. I didn't go home right away. I stood just outside the hotel's revolving doors, watching the lights shift across the marble floor as guests trickled out in pairs. Laughter floated up the steps, then faded into the traffic's low hush. I could still feel the microphone in my hand, the way the room had held still for a beat longer than usual, enough to register. Not dramatic, just undeniable. Margaret stepped out first, linking her arm with Richard's. She didn't say much, she didn't have to. A small nod, the kind people exchange when something simple and correct has been put back where it belongs. "Call me this week," she said. "Tuesday is good." Then she was gone, her heels tapping a clean rhythm down the stairs. I waited a minute more before heading toward the corner where the valet line ebbed and flowed. My parents appeared in the glass behind me, their reflections crisp under the lobby light. Mom paused to adjust her wrap. Dad said something I couldn't hear. Neither of them looked my way. They didn't leave together. The gap between them told its own story. Back in my apartment, I set the invitation on the counter and ran water in the sink, the white noise filling the room. My phone buzzed once, no message, just a calendar reminder I'd forgotten to delete. I turned it off and let the silence settle. That night, I slept the way you do after a storm has passed, but the furniture is still where you left it, aware that nothing has been smashed, but everything has shifted a few inches in your mind. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic happened. No long emails, no apologies drafted at 2 a.m., no sudden deliveries. Life kept its usual pace, but certain doors, the ones that made you step aside, didn't open as easily for other people anymore. A receptionist who used to skip my name on a sign-in sheet looked up and said, "Good morning, Miss Carter," like she'd always meant to. A neighbor who once confused me with another tenant stopped, remembered, and nodded. Small things. Not proof, just alignment. 3 evenings later, a link arrived from my sister. No caption, just the cloud folder wedding photos final cut. I stood at the counter, the kitchen light making a bright circle on the screen. The thumbnails marched across bouquet toasts, sparklers, the dip in the first dance. I scrolled slowly, letting the moments pass without catching on me. Then the family section loaded rows of posed frames, everyone arranged just so. I recognized the angles, the choreography. I recognized the space I'd been given none. Near the end, there was a subfolder labeled Candids. I clicked without thinking, and the world tilted half an inch. There, between a blurred shot of the band and a table of half-finished desserts, was a photo I didn't know anyone had taken me by the ballroom's coat alcove, hand on the end hook, like a person might hold the railing of a ferry. I wasn't looking at the camera. I was watching the entry to the photo area. The focus was shallow, my face sharp, everything behind me soft, but you could still make out the photographer lifting his arm, the brief flare of a flash, my mother's silver dress like a slice of light to one side. There was a second candid just after it. The groom Michael angled toward the photographer, one hand lifted, mouth open, as if he'd said, "Hold on." You couldn't hear him, of course, but you could see the moment about to break in too. I kept scrolling. The album didn't show what happened next. Not there. But I knew. I knew because of the fundraiser, because of the pause in the room when my name was said, because of the way my parents left separately and didn't speak in the glass. A shape had moved in front of another shape, and once you notice that kind of shift, you can't unsee it in the older pictures either. I closed the album and set the phone down. The apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator's low hum. I rinsed a glass and turned it in my hand until the last bead of water slid away. Then I opened the closet and, without quite meaning to, rested my fingers on the coat hooks lined across the top rail. Metal on skin, cool, solid, ordinary. The kind of thing that doesn't tell you what to feel. It just holds what you put there. On Saturday, an envelope arrived, heavy stock, my name centered in neat black type. Inside was a handwritten card from the groom's mother. "You carried yourself with grace," it read. "That's not invisible. Not anymore." No flourish, no invitation attached, no request, just recognition. I slid the card back into the envelope and placed it with the fundraiser invitation on the counter. 2 objects. 1 meaning. That night I went for a walk past the hotel where the reception had been. Through the windows, another wedding was in full swing. New faces, same choreography. A photographer counted down with his fingers. A grandmother laughed at something no one else heard. The revolving doors pushed 3 guests out in a cluster, all in line with one another and talking at once. I watched for a minute, then kept moving the soles of my shoes quiet against the sidewalk. At the corner, my phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "I'd like to talk when you're ready." I didn't have to guess who it was. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. Not no. Not yet. Just mine to decide. When I reached my building, I held the lobby door an extra second for a delivery driver balancing 2 boxes. He nodded his thanks without looking up. In the elevator, I caught my reflection in the brushed metal panel centered, not pushed, to either edge. The doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped out the hallway, empty and still. Inside, I set my keys in the dish, turned off the kitchen light, and crossed to the closet. The row of hooks met my hand again, familiar now. I hung my coat carefully, precisely where I wanted it, and let the door ease shut on its hinges. No speech, no lesson. Just the quiet sound of wood finding wood and a room that understood I was in it. Some moments don't end when the room empties. They stay quiet, like a light you forgot you left on, changing the way you see every doorway you walk through afterward. You don't have to push, you don't have to explain. People simply shift, making space you no longer have to ask for. And when it happens, you realize the silence was never empty, it was yours all along.